Chapter 5 Disaster. The first thing Mr. Spallini wanted to see was James's costume. He would not explain to Mandy why it was so important, but just looked mysterious. After that, of course, he wanted to meet Mrs. Garvey and get her permission to help. Mandy and James arranged to take Mr. Spallini to Lilac Cottage after dinner so that he could see Grandma's design for James's costume. Back at Animal Ark, Mandy was so excited she could hardly eat her meal because she was talking about Mr. Spallini. Dr. Emily phoned Jack's mother and came back all smiles. Mr. Spallini has been showing the gardeners his scrapbook, she said. He's quite famous, you know. I think he's wonderful, said Mandy. He was also asking about a vet, said Dr. Emily. One of his doves is not eating, so I've promised to go over and have a look at it. I'll drive you all to Grandma and Grandpa's afterwards. Maybe Mr. Spallini will show you some tricks, Mandy said. Then she frowned. I hope the dove isn't sick. When Mandy and Dr. Emily arrived at Hobart's Corner, Mr. Spallini was too concerned about his dove to do tricks for them. Mandy could see by his worried face that he really loved all his animals. Dr. Emily took the bird expertly in her hands. She ran her fingers carefully over its breast and up toward its throat. Then she pressed gently on each side of the dove's neck and watched as the bird tried to swallow. What's her name, Mr. Spallini? Mandy asked. The magician was watching Dr. Emily intently. Bianca, he said, without taking his eyes off her. Dr. Emily finished examining Bianca and frowned slightly. There seems to be something in her throat, she said. I'll have to take her into Animal Ark and have a closer look. Mr. Spallini nodded and got a traveling cage for the dove. Bianca is a very clever bird, he said, closing the latch of the cage carefully. I'd be lost without her. Dr. Emily smiled. I imagine she's a very valuable bird as well, she said. Mr. Spallini nodded. She is very special. Dr. Emily took the cage gently from him. I'm sure she'll be fine, Mr. Spallini, she said. I'll be able to let you know how she is once I've examined her more thoroughly. Mr. Spallini nodded again, but Mandy could see he was still worried as they all got into the car. Dr. Emily picked up James and then drove them all to Lilac Cottage. As they walked down the path toward the cottage, Grandma came out the front door. Grandma, said Mandy, this is Mr. Spallini. He's a magician, and he's going to help James with some magic tricks. Grandma looked at Mr. Spallini, and her face lit up. The spectacular Spallini, she said. I saw you last year in York. You were very good. Mr. Spallini bowed, drew a colored scarf magically from between his fingers, and presented it to Grandma. Well, said Grandma, it certainly must be very useful being a magician. I'm always losing scarves. It would be nice to conjure one up just like that when I needed it. Mandy smiled, but she was still thinking about Bianca. Are you sure she'll be all right? She whispered to her mother. Dr. Emily smiled reassuringly. Don't worry, it's probably just something stuck in her throat. They followed Grandma indoors, and soon Mr. Spallini was examining James's costume inside and out. As I thought, he said. Not enough pockets. He looked at James. Magicians need lots of pockets. Grandma, James, and Mr. Spallini went into a huddle over the costume while Grandpa brought a selection of fresh vegetables in from the garden for Dr. Emily. You don't get those by waving a magic wand, Dr. Emily said. Grandpa scratched his head. It's a different kind of magic, getting things to grow, he said. At last, Mr. Spallini was satisfied with the new design for the costume, and Dr. Emily drove him back to Hobart's Corner. Come at about 8 o'clock this evening, she said. You'll be able to see Bianca then. Mr. Spallini said he would, but as they drove off, Mandy could see he was still very concerned. Back at Animal Ark, Mandy hung around outside the room used as the operating room while Dr. Emily examined Bianca. Simon, the veterinary nurse for the practice, was on hand to help. It seemed like hours before Simon poked his head outside. All over now, he said, smiling at Mandy. She hurried inside. You can stop worrying now, said her mother. Bianca had a huge seed stuck deep down in her throat. I removed it while she was asleep. She'll feel a bit sore for a little while, but she'll feel all better in a day or two. Mandy walked over to the operating table and looked down at the beautiful white dove, just beginning to stir. Her eyelids fluttered slightly. We'll keep her overnight, said Dr. Emily, and she'll be able to go home tomorrow. And will she really be all right? Said Mandy. She'll be the star of Mr. Splaney's next show. You wait and see, Dr. Emily said. Mandy smiled. She would have good news for Mr. Splaney. When Mr. Splaney arrived, he was full of thanks and very relieved to see Bianca looking well again. Mom says she'll be the star of the show again in no time, Mandy said to him. Mr. Splaney smiled. I hope so, he said. She loves performing. Isn't she frightened by all the crowds? Mandy said. Not at all, said Mr. Splaney. She's used to it by now. Mandy frowned. I'm worried that some of the animals in the play will be frightened, she said. Mr. Splaney looked serious. You must be sure that all the pets are able to stay close to their owners, he said. That will give them the confidence. It's also a good idea to have a quiet place backstage for them when they're not on stage. He hesitated. I could speak to Mrs. Garvey about the arrangements for the animals. Mandy smiled. Would you? She said. That would be great. It would be terrible if any of the pets got frightened. We have a pets rehearsal on Monday morning. All the animals will be there. Then I'll come on Monday as well, said Mr. Splaney. Mandy smiled. Thanks, Mr. Splaney, she said. That would be terrific. On Monday morning, Mrs. Garvey took Mr. Splaney into her office for a long talk about the arrangements for the pets, and of course, James's tricks. Then she gathered the cast of the play together for the pets rehearsal. We are very lucky to have a real magician to help us, she said to them. Mr. Splaney is going to come to all our rehearsals, and he's going to teach James some magic tricks. Amy Fenton jumped up and down. Oh, good, she said to James. And then you can show us how they're done, James. James shook his head, looking serious. No, I can't, he said. Mr. Splaney says I have to promise to keep the tricks a secret. Amy looked disappointed, but she soon brightened up. She had Minnie with her, and she remembered she was going to do her whole gymnastics routine for the first time today. She was supposed to be the wizard's pet monkey, and they all had to imagine her in a monkey costume. Everybody cheered like crazy when Amy did her gymnastics. She was really good. She did some somersaults and backflips. She even did splits. She looked very proud when she finished. Then it was Gary's turn with Gertie, but poor Gary just wasn't any good at the recorder. That doesn't matter, said Mr. Splaney. Who is good at the recorder? Pam Stanton put her hand in the air. I am, she said, but I've got a part in the play already with Ginny, my guinea pig. And anyway, Gary likes being the snake charmer. But Gary can still be the snake charmer, Mr. Splaney said to Pam. You can play the recorder off stage while Gary mimes. Gary looked puzzled. But won't Gertie go looking for the music? Mr. Splaney shook his head. You can't actually charm snakes, you know, he said gently. But you could pretend you were charming Gertie. You could hold the recorder with one hand, lift Gertie up with the other, and sway as if she was dancing. Gary's face lit up. Oh, that's no problem. I'll be good at swaying. It's just the play I'm bad at. Everybody laughed, except Amy. She had just looked down at Minnie's cage, which was sitting on a low table on the stage. It was empty. Minnie, she said. Oh, where's Minnie? She's escaped. Oh, no, said Richard Tanner. I haven't put Duchess back in her basket yet. Where is she? Mandy looked around the stage. There, look, she said as the Persian cat streaked across the floor. Mandy had never seen Duchess move so fast. Something small and white scampered across the stage toward the curtain at the side. There's Minnie, Amy wailed, and the little girl made a dash for the corner of the stage. Minnie ran up the curtain and onto the top of a piece of scenery. Duchess stood at the bottom, ready to spring, but before the cat could do anything, Amy scrambled up the wall, edged out along the scenery, and stretched out her hand toward Minnie. Richard pounced on Duchess, scooped her into his arms, and put her back in the basket. Watch out, Amy, Mrs. Garvey called, but it was too late. The scenery toppled forward just as Amy grasped Minnie. Amy, Minnie, and the scenery came down with a crash. Mandy was the first to reach them. Oh, is Minnie all right? Amy said. Mandy scooped up the little mouse before she could run off again and held her securely. I've got her. She's fine, she said. What about you? Amy started to get to her feet. I'm fine. Ouch, she said. My ankle hurts. Mrs. Garvey arrived. Lie still, Amy, she said. Are you all right? Oh, my ankle, Amy wailed. Mrs. Garvey felt Amy's ankle gently. Then she sat back with a sigh of relief. I don't think it's broken, she said, but it's probably sprained. We'll have to get the nurse to take a look at you. She looked at Amy and shook her head. I'm afraid there won't be any gymnastics for you for a while, Amy, she said. Amy looked up. 2 big tears came into her eyes and spilled over. Oh, no, she said, and Minnie doesn't have a part either. Mandy looked down at the mouse, sitting quietly in her hands. Minnie seemed fine after her adventure. Mandy put the little animal back in the cage. At least Minnie isn't hurt, Mandy said, trying to cheer Amy up. Amy looked at her and nodded. She was very white. Her ankle must be really painful. Oh, I know, she said. I don't really mind as long as Minnie is all right. I'm just a bit disappointed, that's all. I was really looking forward to being in the play. Mandy smiled and handed the cage to her. Amy was being very brave about all of this. Mandy just wished she could wave James's magic wand and make her ankle better.